Hello and greetings, I return! I'll spare you the excuses and just cut right to the chase. Today, I present the next chapter in Handplates' Recollections. As a reminder, this series is a variation of Zarla's Undertale story Handplates, but where Gaster ends up getting caught and Sans and Papyrus are freed, and start living in the castle out of his reach. The boys were also rescued before they got their blasters in the original comic, but leaving them without those powers just didn't seem right. So this is the story of how I shot the Serif. Like this? Papyrus held his right arm up, four-fingered hand facing palm out. Gaster nodded.
Yes. Now keep your eye on the target as you build the energy. You need to remain focused from the start, or else the attack won't manifest properly.
The scientist and the young skeleton were out in the underground palace's vast, yet at the moment empty, courtyard. Gaster held his hands behind his back sedately, while a set of translucent magic hands signed what he was saying to the spectators behind him. Asgore was present for the magic lesson, filling the role of chaperone for Alphys. She had been unable to attend. Apparently something unexpected had arisen with one of her latest projects, and it needed her full attention. An irritated Sans stood next to the king, arms crossed, preparing to serve his usual role as head heckler of the royal scientist. Papyrus closed his eyes, bones rattling with the strain of his effort. The air around the four seemed to change. It went still and unnaturally quiet, and then there was a low buzzing just on the edge of hearing. The buzzing rose to a whine, and eventually a dull roar. Asgore made a sound of surprise, and Sans' brow rose as he felt the force vibrate through his bones. Gaster stood motionless. A light flickered in front of Papyrus, just once before fading again.
That's it. You're close,
Gaster said.
Keep your intent focused on manifesting a physical shell for your magic. Don't worry about the form. Your soul will take care of that.
Papyrus clenched his jaw, bringing his other arm out to embrace the one he was holding up. The light sparked again, then flashed so bright it momentarily blinded all around. But it was drowned out by the feral growl which echoed through the courtyard. When the spots cleared from Gaster's vision, he saw it. A spiked, bestial skull floated just feet in front of Papyrus. At a glance, he knew it had been summoned correctly, and the magic within felt stable and well-contained. He looked at Papyrus. The child's eyes were alight with wonder. His arm was still stretched out in front of him, but in a way which indicated he wanted to touch the manifestation. Behind them, their audience of two cheered and clapped. Gaster started, having nearly forgotten they were there.
Absolutely splendid. Good show,
Asgore called. Whoa, that's awesome, bro, Sans said, sounding as excited as he ever managed to get. Gaster made like he was clearing his throat.
Yes, you seem to have the basic steps. Though next time you should probably try encapsulating a larger amount of energy. The blaster is properly formed, though it is rather small.
And small it was. Puny, really. Not much larger than Papyrus's own skull. Not to mention the outlandish eyeballs which bugged out of its sockets and swiveled around in every direction. But Gaster chose not to bring that up. Each blaster took on a few unique traits based on the soul of the user. The eyes may be a permanent feature of his.
Disperse it and try again,
Gaster said. The spell of wonderment which had taken hold of Papyrus broke. Aw, but don't I get to fire it? He whined. You fired yours before.
That wasn't my first try. You aren't ready for that yet,
Gaster responded firmly.
Once you can manifest your blaster at a proper size, then we will practice firing. Disperse it. Now.
Come now, Gaster. What's the harm in letting him give it a go?
Asgore cajoled. Gaster turned, frowning at the king.
Your Majesty, you asked me to teach them to control these powers in the best way I saw fit. That is exactly what I am doing.
Asgore chuckled at him.
Yes, but that doesn't mean they can't have a little fun. It's good for boys their age.
He tilted his head a bit.
And yours too.
Gaster's frown turned to a petulant glare, and he felt his face flush a little. As he turned back to his student, he caught a glimpse of Sans smirking at him. Papyrus's eyelights were twinkling brighter than ever. It gave him the appearance of a dog monster begging for pets.
Very well.
Gaster grumbled.
Take aim at the dummy. Focus the energy in the blaster to a fine point, then release it.
Papyrus put his arm out again, and the tiny blaster spun around twice before pointing at the dummy, making a small rah sound which might have sounded intimidating to a newborn mouse. The child focused with all his might. If he had a tongue, it surely would have been sticking out. Soon the blaster began to vibrate, emitting a small buzzing sound which slowly grew louder and more high-pitched. Its jaws parted, and a fist-sized ball of light gathered in its mouth. Finally, the blaster's eyes bugged out twice as large, and a beam of pure magical energy burst from its mouth with a slightly louder and more sustained rah. The attack only lasted a second, and did little more than singe the snout of the lifeless training dummy. But Papyrus threw a fist in the air and whooped with elation. The two behind him clapped and cheered again, and he grinned back at them before looking up at Gaster. He was seeking praise. The glimmer in his eyes was unmistakable. But the scientist knew he could do better.
Now that that's out of your system, disperse it. Summon it again, concentrating on a higher level of energy this time.
Papyrus's expression fell for a moment, but his eyes came alight with the challenge, and he nodded. Nearly an hour later, Papyrus had made impressive progress. His blaster had grown to be as long as he was tall, and Gaster was having to walk an inordinate distance down the courtyard to retrieve the dummy after each blast. Though Gaster didn't mind chasing it down each time. Every step was more progress, and if anything, the old skeleton moved a bit quicker with each turn. At last, Gaster returned and took note of how sweaty and winded the child had become.
That will do for today, I think,
he said.
Oh, okay,
Papyrus panted, too wobbly and out of breath to manage anything more. He must have been tired if even he wasn't going to insist on one more round. And then he did it again, looked at Gaster with those eyes, seeking approval. Papyrus still had a long way to go before he reached his full potential. If he was given too much positive reinforcement now, Gaster feared it would cause his abilities to plateau sooner than projected. But one glance at Asgore told him that withholding praise right now was not a wise choice.
Your performance has been adequate so far,
he began. Asgore crossed his arms. Gaster winced.
That is, you are doing well. Keep it up.
Papyrus emitted an undignified squeal and bounced on his toes so violently he threatened to become airborne. Gaster rolled his eye.
Now you go back there and stay out of the way.
Then he turned to Sans.
All right, your turn.
Sans groaned, looking up at the king. Do I have to? I think I'm getting kind of tired just watching my brother. Not sure I got it in me today. Asgore knelt down and set a paw on Sans' back, looking him in the eyes.
You don't have to do anything you don't want to do, but I do think it would be good for you to try at least once.
Good for me or him?
Both. Now go. You'll do fine.
Asgore gave Sans' back a gentle tap, which was enough to jettison the fragile monster forward 2 whole steps. Sans was just about to turn around and give the king a churlish look when Papyrus stepped in front of him, putting a shaky hand on his shoulder.
Come on, brother. I know you can do it.
Up close, Papyrus looked even worse. The sleeveless shirt he'd insisted on wearing for training was soaked with sweat, and his usually impeccable posture was slumped. But despite looking more exhausted than Sans had ever seen him, there was a sort of glow about his brother, though not in his eyes. He looked satisfied and proud, and happy, genuinely happy. That pain that always hid behind his eyes was gone, if just for a moment. Sans rolled his eyes and moaned. Fine. Okay, I'll try. Papyrus grinned even wider and swept Sans into a sweaty embrace. Sans scrunched up his face. Heh, If you sweat anymore, I'll have to start calling you Perspyrus. Papyrus groaned, ending the hug and crossing his arms.
Why must you ruin every great moment with a pun?
Sans closed one eye socket and tilted his head. 'Cause it's fun, bro. I thought we were out here to have a blast. Papyrus groaned even louder and stamped his foot.
Ugh, that's it. Go, I'm done with you.
He marched over to stand by the king where Sans had been before. Sans giggled quietly to himself, then shoved his hands in his pockets and went to stand beside Gaster.
Are you ready then?
The taller skeleton asked. Sans did not turn to face him. He faced straight forward at the training dummy. Sure, let's get this over with. So what? I hold out my hand like this, right? Sans removed his left hand from his pocket and held it out in front of him. Gaster sighed.
No, I must first awaken the ability in your soul, remember?
Sans grimaced, letting his hand drop. Ah, come on. You said we already know how to do it. Can't I just do it on my own? The scientist crossed his arms.
So you were listening to the lecture earlier. Good. You could potentially trigger it on your own one day, yes, but it would likely happen during a moment of extreme stress or fear, not a time you want to be learning how to control your new attacks.
If that's what triggers it, how come I didn't blast you to smithereens a long time ago? Sans asked sardonically.
Sans?
Asgore rumbled the child's name warningly, but Gaster waved him off.
Your magic abilities weren't mature enough. Now if you would face me, I will activate it.
Sans' shoulders stiffened, but after a few moments he reluctantly turned. He glared at that single eye as Gaster squatted down in front of him, holding up his hand, palm out. The hand flashed blue, and Sans felt his soul turn cold and heavy. He panicked, hands flying to his chest, which now glowed blue beneath his hoodie. It had been so long since he'd felt blue magic. Sans had forgotten how helpless and vulnerable it made him feel. He tried to step backward, to get away from the scientist, but his feet slid uselessly in the dirt, unable to find purchase.
Stop that.
Gaster murmured, tightening his hold.
Gaster, I said stop!
Asgore's roar was accompanied by a flash of orange on the edge of Gaster's vision. He whipped his head around. He hadn't noticed the king had taken several steps toward them, his hands and eyes glowing a brilliant orange.
Release him!
The boss monster growled. Gaster dropped his hold, and Sans immediately tumbled backward, as though a rope he'd been pulling on was suddenly cut. The child scrabbled away on all fours, his left eye wide and flashing purple and yellow, never leaving Gaster.
Sans, calm down. You're all right.
Asgore said, slowly approaching him with one hand extended placatingly. Before he could get close, Papyrus shot past him and knelt over Sans.
Brother, it's okay. I'm here, you're safe, everything is okay.
Papyrus soothed, wrapping Sans in his arms. He'd stopped trying to back up and was inhaling in short, quick gasps, clutching his brother tightly. Papyrus continued to chant calming things as he rubbed Sans' back, glowing his own eyes a soft orange. After several moments, Sans' eyelights returned to normal, and he found his words again. Thanks, bro. I think I'm good now.
Are you sure? You're still shaking a lot.
Yeah, just help me up, maybe? Papyrus took Sans by an arm and helped him stand, watching his movements carefully. Once he was on his feet without his brother's support, the two looked over at the adults. They were several yards away and in the middle of a very heated discussion. Asgore was shouting and pointing one of his huge fingers directly at Gaster, which he periodically whipped toward the boys and back again without looking at them. Gaster was speaking and signing indignantly, barely even stopping to listen to the king. The brothers watched with interest. The two men seemed to have forgotten they were even there. They knew they weren't meant to hear this dispute, but it was hard not to. The king's booming voice echoed all around the courtyard.
You need to think before you do these things. You have to look at your actions from their point of view.
I was, and what I saw was that it had no such effect on the other.
They aren't the same, and you know that. You know Sans doesn't trust as easily as him.
I know, and I thought by demonstrating I wasn't going to hurt him while holding with blue magic.
That isn't how it works, Gaster.
Asgore stomped the ground so hard both boys felt it shudder.
You don't earn someone's trust by cornering them and forcing them to obey.
Well, what do you expect me to do? If you won't let me do this, then I won't be able to teach him anything.
I expect you to listen. You may be teaching him, but you aren't in charge. The moment he says stop, you stop. Am I clear?
But he didn't.
Enough!
The king bellowed, so loudly that even Gaster winced and stopped signing. His eye flicked toward the boys for a moment, which prompted Asgore to do the same. The king sighed heavily and ran a paw down his face.
That's enough for today,
he said, at a much more reasonable volume.
You boys can go. I need to speak with Dr. Gaster alone.
Sans and Papyrus looked at each other, then back at Asgore. Nah, I'm good now, Sans said. It just took me by surprise, that's all. He shot Gaster a nasty look. You didn't do that to my bro when you unlocked his power. Gaster adjusted his glasses.
Your brother isn't nearly as recalcitrant,
he muttered dryly. Asgore put himself between them.
Sans, I don't think this is a good time. You're both too worked up.
No, I mean it, Sans interrupted. I mean, I want to do this, Your Majesty. I really do. I'm ready this time. The king gave Sans a weary look, then made eye contact with Papyrus for a moment. The brother gave him a small nod, and Asgore sighed yet again.
Fine, then.
He turned to Gaster, who was looking a lot less hostile than he had a few moments ago. His hands were in his pockets, and his magic hands hung still at his sides. Asgore stepped close to him, forcing Gaster to crane his neck up to meet his eyes.
Dr. Gaster, do you think you're ready this time?
Gaster's face was carefully blank.
Yes, Your Majesty, if you will allow it.
The king nodded.
Fine, then.
He motioned for Sans to join them. Sans began walking forward when he felt a tug on his arm. He looked back at Papyrus, who gave his arm a little squeeze. Sans smiled and set a hand on his brother's, squeezing back. Papyrus returned the smile, then let go. Once again, Sans found himself standing in front of Gaster. The scientist knelt all the way down to his knees this time, while Asgore's shadow lingered over them both.
I will not be using blue magic this time,
Gaster began.
but you are going to have to hold completely still for this to work. Do you understand?
Sans nodded.
All right.
Gaster held his hand up. Yellow tendrils of magic sprouted from the surface, flicking around the skeleton's fingers, leaping across the hole in the center of his palm. Sans' legs shivered with the impulse to step back, but he didn't move. He hoped his bones wouldn't begin to rattle.
This will only take a few seconds, though time is relative, so that may change for you. I will touch my hand to your chest. When I do that, your soul will respond. It will feel strange, but it will not hurt. I will also not be holding you in place.
You said this would be worse for you, Sans blurted. He didn't want to drag this out, but that was something that had stuck out in his mind, a piece that didn't quite fit. Gaster grimaced.
Yes, because I am initiating the connection, my soul will be the most open.
He glanced up at Asgore, then gave Sans a stern look.
Just try not to look at anything that isn't yours. Are you ready?
Sans didn't like how any of this sounded, and he felt anything but ready. He nodded. Both agonizingly slowly and far too quickly, Gaster's hand made contact with Sans' chest. His soul came alive with magic that felt distinctly like his, only more, much more. The power was almost overwhelming. It felt as though if he let it overtake him, he'd lose himself completely. Sans took deep, calming breaths. It'll be over soon. It'll be over soon. It'll be over soon.
Good. That's it.
The intrusive thought almost broke Sans' concentration completely. It was one thing for strange magic to be coursing through his soul, but it was another thing entirely for strange thoughts to be floating through his head. His eyes snapped open, which was surprising because he hadn't remembered closing them. Everything was tinted with a haze of blue, and sparks of magic floated around the edge of his vision. He was vaguely aware that his left eye was surging with power, bright and strong. Right in front of him he could see Gaster, whose head was bowed and eye was shut. The magic swirling around him was yellow, but something wasn't right. If Sans shifted his vision just a bit, everything seemed to go black, as though something were covering his eyes.
Close your eyes.
The voice in his head intoned.
You'll only disorient yourself.
It wasn't a scolding, and nor was it an order, just simple advice. Sans shut his eyes again.
Now, I'm going to transfer a memory of mine into your soul. You can't just let it go by, or it won't take. You have to completely accept it as your own. Ready?
Sans nodded, then recalled both of their eyes were shut. Yeah, he said in his mind, unsure of how to make himself heard. Apparently that did the trick, because immediately his thoughts were assailed with light, colors, sounds, and smells. Visions and sensations both familiar and totally strange to him. Trees and a forest clearing, smelling of pine and fallen leaves. Targets and dummies set up far away. The air moving and rustling the trees, like the way it sometimes blew through the caves and waterfall, but so much more. The ceiling above, which was bright blue and seemed to go on forever. Suddenly his focus was shifted from the tactile to the abstract. Emotion both his own and not flitted through him. Anticipation, fear, excitement, a hunger to learn, a desire to please, a touch of frustration for how long it had taken to get here. And then there was power. Their perspective became locked, lined up perfectly with a target on the far end of the clearing, though it was hard to tell exactly how far the target was. Something was building around his soul, pulling magic from it like a taut string. Something familiar, something old and known, but at the same time completely new and his own. It was still his magic. It was just a new way to manifest it. Raw and formless it grew beside him, unchecked yet in control. A massive amount of energy built around him, and just when it felt as though it would burst in every direction, something snapped into place and the pull on his soul stopped. Suddenly he was in shadow. A low growl rumbled above him, which he felt more than he heard. He'd done it! He'd done it! Something that might have been a voice behind him said something, and he nodded vigorously. Now to fire. Exerting the authority he instinctively knew he had over his creation, he drew his arm back and thrust it forward, pointing directly at the target. In a brief moment of awareness, Sans noticed that the hand held out in front of him had no hole in the palm.
Almost there. Stay focused.
And then it fired. With a roar of magic and primal rage, the blaster released the energy it had already been granted. There was no extra pull of magic from the caster's soul. It already had all it needed. The target disappeared from view as the beam of light engulfed it. It was impossibly bright, but he knew better than to take his eye off the target. In mere moments it was done, and the blaster vanished as though it had never been there at all. The target was also gone. Sans felt himself separating again, and the visions around him began to fade. Suddenly able to control his movements, he wheeled his vision around, trying to sharpen his senses to catch whatever else he could. He heard that voice behind him again, and he pursued it. He called out to the faceless figure, but they didn't respond, nor did their words become any clearer. At last, everything faded to black, and he was completely alone.
I expected this, Your Majesty. His stamina has always been very low.
When will he wake up?
Any second now. It shouldn't have been that tiring for him.
Sans recognized the voices around him, and immediately they made sense. Gaster had been showing him how to use the magic blaster, and Papyrus had been nearby. The king was probably still there too. What he didn't understand was where his body was. He wasn't standing, and he felt like he was facing upward, but he wasn't on the ground either. He seemed to be floating? He jerked. It was blue magic. He was holding him with blue magic again.
Get off!
Sans slurred, his eyes opening wide. His vision was blurry. All he could see was vague shapes hovering over him. He swatted at them blindly. The force that was holding him adjusted to his flailing and gripped him tighter. He was being held prone, high enough to not feel the ground beneath him.
Sans, be still. You fell unconscious after the memory transference. Do you remember?
Yes, I do. Now let me go!
If I do, you will fall.
Gaster said dryly.
You said you wouldn't use blue magic again.
I'm not.
Sans paused in his thrashing. As his sight continued to clear, Gaster's face was the first to come into view, directly above him. Papyrus was just off to the side, looking very concerned, but allowing Gaster to take the lead. Then he figured it out. Sans was in Gaster's arms. One of his punctured hands supported the child's head while the other was at his back, and the rest of his body was draped across the scientist's long forearm. Oh. Gaster raised a brow.
Quite. Do you think you can stand?
He slowly lowered Sans until the child felt his feet brush dirt. Yeah, Sans muttered. The hand supporting his head moved to his back, and he leapt forward to get away from it. Unfortunately, his balance hadn't caught up with him, and Sans began to topple forward. Papyrus moved to help him, but Gaster got him first, catching him by his upper arm. "All right, I've got it! Quit!" he snapped, slapping the hand away. Gaster let go, but he remained ready to catch him again.
Brother, how do you feel? Do you remember how to do it?
Papyrus asked. Sans paused to speak, but nothing came out. Did he remember? Suddenly he was drawing a blank on what exactly he saw.
You may not be able to consciously remember it, but when the time comes, you will.
Gaster said.
I believe the memory took just fine.
Memory? So that was your memory? Gaster's face went blank.
Yes.
Did you see any of my memories? Sans asked suspiciously. Gaster huffed.
No. It was entirely one way, I assure you.
Sans craned his neck up to see the king smiling above him.
You did very well, Sans. I'm proud of you.
Apparently he'd never left his spot from the minute it started. They all went quiet for a moment. Sans became aware that everyone was looking at him, as though expecting him to lash out or keel over again. The attention made him itch. He just wanted to go back to his room and sleep. "So, that's it? I can do it now?" he asked.
Yes, I believe so.
Gaster said, wincing as his joints popped and creaked.
If you feel up to trying, we can test it right now.
Suddenly, sleep was the last thing Sans wanted. He grinned.
Yeah, I think I'm up for some target practice.
Sans' first attempt at a blaster was even weaker than Papyrus's, so small it could sit in his hand with room to spare. Its blast didn't even reach the training dummy, though as with his brother, with time and practice Sans' blaster began to grow larger.
Wowee, I don't think I've ever seen him try so hard at something before.
Papyrus whispered to the king. Asgore laughed softly.
He's always had it in him. I think he just never had the proper motivation.
Papyrus nodded and watched Sans continue to summon and disperse his attack on Gaster's command. Sweat was running down his skull and staining the back of his hoodie. Papyrus was certainly proud of his brother for giving it his all, but he was worried he was going to push himself too far, and for the wrong reason. Gaster was a rigorous taskmaster, barely allowing his charge to take more than a couple of breaths between summonings. He knew such a heavy hand was more likely to frustrate Sans than encourage him, but the little skeleton plugged on, much to his surprise. It was like he was out to prove something, though what Gaster was having trouble deciphering. He wondered if he was trying to outdo the blast he saw in the memory. Well, that was very unlikely. Sans had taken multiple shots now, all never dealing more than 1 point of damage, if anything at all. Perhaps seeing how far his brother had gotten was motivating him? But Papyrus's superior skills with magic had never made him react this way before. Whatever the reason, it was refreshing to see the boy try to achieve his full potential for once. Gaster certainly wasn't going to discourage it. He was curious to see exactly how far Sans would get before running out of steam. A low growl from behind him snapped Gaster out of his reverie. He turned just in time to lock eyes with an enormous bestial skull. The jaws opened, light pooled between teeth as long as his arms. Reflexively, Gaster shielded his face and took a step back. The beam fired. Sans watched with immense satisfaction as piercing light engulfed the scientist. He knew this was probably the last shot he had in him for today, and he knew it would get him into a lot of trouble. So he was going to make it worth every second. He kept his eye locked on his target and his arm fully extended the whole time, pouring every ounce of magic he had left to spare into the blast. When the light faded, Sans blew out the breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He inhaled raggedly as his eyes adjusted. Asgore and Papyrus were shouting somewhere out of view, but he ignored them. Gaster still stood, and he did not look very worse for wear. He lowered his arms slightly, blinked, then brought them to his sides. He turned to Sans. All the attack seemed to have done was blow some dirt onto Gaster's clothes and knock his glasses slightly askew. Sans felt a little sting in his soul as he realized exactly how little he'd done. Gaster rolled his eye.
Your damage output needs work,
he muttered, not bothering to sign it. He straightened his glasses and began brushing the dirt off his sweater. Asgore ran up to them, apparently unsure whether to rebuke Sans or fuss over Gaster. He settled on both. Sans grinned sheepishly and stuffed his hands in his pockets, preparing to accept whatever punishment the king assigned him. Ah, well, it was worth a shot.